Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. Most people imagine the largest creatures in the ocean as rulers, something powerful, something dominant, something that controls everything around it. But if you go deep enough, that idea begins to fall apart, because in the deepest parts of the ocean, the largest creatures do not rule. They do not fight. They do not chase. They do not defend anything. They simply move slowly, carefully, as if every moment is measured against something invisible. And tonight, we're going to follow them, not to see how they dominate the deep, but to understand why they don't. What does it mean to rule? There is a quiet idea most of us carry so quietly that we rarely stop to question it, that in every world there must be something at the top, a center, a figure, a presence that defines everything around it. We don't always say it out loud, but we feel it, because on land, this idea seems to be everywhere, in forests, in deserts, in the shifting balance between predator and prey. There are patterns we recognize. Some animals move together, some lead, some follow. There are moments of tension and moments of control. And over time, we begin to tell ourselves a story that every system needs structure, that every structure needs a peak, and that at the very top, there must be something that rules. It gives us comfort because it turns complexity into something we can understand. If there is a top, then everything below it has a place. If there is a ruler, then everything else can be arranged around it. But the deeper we move into the ocean, the less that idea holds. At first, it fades slowly. The familiar patterns begin to blur. There are fewer groups, fewer interactions that follow clear rules. Creatures appear, but they do not gather. They move, but not in ways that suggest coordination. And then, as the light disappears, something else happens. The idea of hierarchy itself begins to dissolve. Down here, there is no obvious structure, no layered system of control, no visible chain of command. Only space, endless, quiet, unclaimed space. And yet, this is not an empty place. If you remain still, if you allow your eyes to adjust, not to light, but to absence, you begin to notice something else. Movement, not fast, not urgent, but present. A slow drifting shape, a distant glow, a form that reveals itself only for a moment before returning to darkness. And sometimes that shape is enormous, larger than anything you expected to find in a place like this. A giant. At first glance, it feels obvious what that means. Size suggests power. Presence suggests importance. In the world we know, something that large would dominate its surroundings. It would claim territory. It would influence everything nearby. It would become a kind of center. So when you first encounter a giant in the deep, there is a quiet expectation that this must be it, the ruler, the thing that defines this space. But if you stay, if you watch without expectation, that idea begins to shift. The giant does not behave the way you expect. It does not patrol an area. It does not guard boundaries. It does not move with urgency or purpose that is easy to understand. It drifts slowly, carefully, as if movement itself is something to be considered. There is no display of dominance, no attempt to control what lies around it. Smaller creatures do not scatter in panic. They adjust. They move slightly out of the way, but there is no chaos, no sense of fear in the way we imagine it. And then, just as quietly as it appeared, the giant passes. It does not leave anything behind. No mark, no claim, no sign that this space now belongs to it. And suddenly, the idea of ruling begins to feel different, because what does it mean to rule a place like this? There is no ground to defend in the way we understand it. No borders that remain fixed. Everything here is in motion, not fast motion, but constant. Water shifts, particles fall, currents move in ways that are almost impossible to see, but always present. Even if a creature wanted to control a space, it could not hold it, not for long. And so, the concept of dominance changes. It becomes less about control and more about persistence. Not who commands, but who continues. Not who is strongest in a moment, but who endures over time. If you observe long enough, you begin to understand something subtle. Nothing here is trying to be the center. There is no competition for attention, no need to establish position, because attention itself does not exist in the same way. There is no light to reveal everything at once, no audience, no shared space where multiple creatures gather and interact continuously. Encounters are rare, brief, often accidental, two paths crossing for just a moment and then separating again into the vastness. In that kind of world, what would a ruler even do? There is nothing to organize, nothing to oversee, no system that requires leadership, only individuals, each responding to the same environment, the same pressure, the same cold, the same scarcity. And those forces are the only things that truly shape behavior. The deeper you go, the clearer this becomes. The environment does not belong to any creature. It does not favor size. It does not reward dominance in the way we expect. It simply exists, constant, unchanging in its nature, even as everything within it moves slowly through it. And in that presence, every creature becomes equal in a quiet way, not identical, but equally subject to the same conditions. Even the giants, they may be larger, they may carry more mass through the water, but they are not exempt. They feel the same pressure. They exist within the same limits of energy. They cannot force the environment to change. They can only adapt to it. And perhaps that is the closest thing to a rule that exists here, not imposed by any creature, but defined by the world itself. If you want to continue, you must adjust. If you waste energy, you fade. If you move too quickly, you lose more than you gain. There is no punishment, no enforcement, just consequence, quiet, inevitable consequence. And so, the giants, like everything else, learn to exist within those boundaries, not as rulers, but as participants, part of a system that does not have a center, part of a world that does not organize itself around power, but around balance. A balance so subtle, it almost feels like stillness. And if you remain here long enough to let that idea settle, you may begin to feel something unexpected, that the need for a ruler was never part of this world. It was something we brought with us, a way of understanding that works above but dissolves below, because in the deep, nothing stands at the top. There is no throne waiting to be claimed, no position to rise into, only a vast, quiet space where existence itself is enough, and where even the largest giants move not as kings, but as travelers, passing through a darkness that belongs to no one at all. The giants that shouldn't exist. If you pause for a moment and imagine this place clearly, you may begin to notice something that feels almost impossible. There is no sunlight here, no steady flow of energy rising from below, no vast fields of life producing nourishment, only darkness, cold and distance. Everything feels limited. The water holds very little. Food does not grow here in the way it does near the surface. Nothing is abundant, and yet there are giants, not small, delicate creatures barely holding on, but massive forms, bodies large enough to fill the space around them, shapes that move with weight. Even in a world where weight is softened by water, it feels like a contradiction, because in the world we understand size comes from excess. Where there is more, things grow larger, forests stretch upward. Because light is plentiful, animals become powerful. Because food is reliable, growth follows availability. But here, there is no abundance to support that idea. And so the question begins to form, quietly at first: how can something so large exist in a place that offers so little? The answer does not appear all at once. It unfolds slowly, the same way everything does here. If you watch closely, if you allow time to stretch around the movement of these giants, you begin to see something different. They are not living the way we expect large creatures to live. They are not constantly feeding. They are not searching endlessly for energy. They are waiting long periods of stillness to find their existence. A giant may drift for what feels like hours without any visible action. No sudden bursts of speed, no restless motion, just presence. At first, this stillness might feel like inactivity, but it is not. It is a decision. Every movement in this world has a cost, and for something large, that cost is greater. To move quickly, to chase, to react without thought would consume more energy than this place can provide. So the giants learn something else. They learn how to exist with as little movement as possible. They do not expand their lives outward, they compress them inward. A single motion becomes meaningful. A small shift in direction, a slow opening, a gentle closing. Each action is measured. Nothing is wasted. If you were to follow one of these giants, you might begin to notice how different its rhythm is from anything above. Time stretches. Moments become longer. The space between actions widens, and within that space, the creature continues to exist without needing to do more. It does not grow by consuming constantly. It grows by conserving. This is the first shift. Size here is not built on abundance. It is built on efficiency. But even that is not the whole story, because eventually something else becomes visible. Food does exist here, not in large, predictable sources, but in fragments, tiny particles drifting down from above, the remains of a distant world, a slow, steady fall, like something you might almost mistake for snow. It never stops completely, but it is never enough to create excess. For most creatures, this is barely sufficient, but for the giants, it becomes part of a different strategy. They do not rely on finding large meal. They rely on encountering what drifts into their path. Some wait, positioned in the water, almost motionless, allowing the environment to bring what is needed. Others move slowly through the darkness, not searching actively, but increasing the chance of contact. It is not hunting in the way we imagine. It is not pursuit. It is alignment, placing themselves where life passes and taking only what arrives. And because their lives are stretched across time, this is enough. A small amount over a long duration becomes survival. This is the second shift. Food does not need to be frequent. It only needs to be sufficient over time. And then there is something even quieter, something less visible, but just as important. The giants do not burn energy the way other creatures do. Their bodies are adapted not for speed, but for endurance. Everything is slower. Processes take longer. Reactions are delayed. Even growth itself happens across spans of time we rarely consider. Years passing without urgency. There is no need to rush toward anything because nothing here is moving quickly. The environment does not change suddenly. It remains steady, and so the creatures within it become steady as well. This is the third shift. Life is not accelerated. It is extended. If you stay with this idea, if you let it settle, the presence of giants begins to feel less impossible. Not because the environment has changed, but because your understanding has. They are not large in spite of this world. They are large because they have adapted perfectly to it. They have removed everything unnecessary, every excess movement, every wasted effort, every impulse to act quickly. What remains is something very precise, a form of existence that fits exactly within the limits of this place. And in that precision, size becomes possible, not as a display of power, but as a result of balance. If you return to that first question, how can something so large exist here? You may find that it no longer feels like a contradiction because the assumption behind the question has changed. We imagined that life requires abundance to grow, but here life has shown another path. That growth can come from reduction. That survival can come from restraint. That size does not always mean consuming more. Sometimes it means needing less. And in that quiet realization, the giants of the deep begin to make sense, not as anomalies, not as exceptions, but as expressions of a different rule entirely, a rule that belongs only to this place, where nothing is given freely, where everything is measured, and where existence itself is shaped not by what is available, but by how carefully it is used. So as you continue to drift through this silent world, the presence of these giants no longer feels strange. It feels inevitable, because in a place defined by limits, only those who understand those limits can grow beyond them, and the giants have learned that lesson completely. Presence without control. If you remain here long enough, something subtle begins to change, not in the environment. The darkness stays the same. The cold does not shift. The vast distance between everything remains untouched. What changes is the way you begin to notice things. At first, everything feels empty. There is too much space, too little movement, nothing to focus on. But slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin to sense patterns. Not patterns of structure, not clear systems you can follow, but small disturbances, a shift in the water, a slight difference in the way particles drift, a feeling that something has passed, even if you did not see it. And then, eventually, you do. A shape, large, soft, at the edges, moving slowly enough that it almost blends into stillness. A giant, it does not arrive suddenly. There is no moment of entrance. It is simply there. There, as if it has always been part of this space, and only now you have become aware of it. If you focus too quickly, you might miss it because it does not announce itself. There is no sound, no dramatic motion, only presence. The water around it behaves differently. Currents shift, not violently, but gently. Particles that once drifted in one direction begin to curve. The space feels altered, and yet nothing has been taken. Nothing has been pushed away in force. The giant does not carve a path. It does not break through its surroundings. It moves within them carefully, as if it understands that it is not separate from the space, but part of it. This is where something interesting begins to emerge, because in the world we know, size changes everything. A large presence creates impact. It dominates space. It forces reactions. But here, that expectation does not hold. The giant does not dominate. It influences quietly, without intention, that is easy to recognize. Smaller creatures respond, but not in panic. They shift slightly. They adjust their path. Sometimes they do nothing at all. There is no sudden dispersal, no frantic movement away, just subtle change, as if everything here has learned to exist with everything else without conflict, unless it is absolutely necessary. And even then, conflict is rare because conflict costs energy. And in this place, energy is everything. So instead of control, what emerges is balance. The giant moves, the environment adjusts, other creatures respond just enough to continue. Nothing escalates, nothing becomes more than it needs to be. If you follow the giant, if you allow your attention to stay with it, you begin to notice how little it actually does. There is no rush, no change in pace. It does not accelerate. It does not react suddenly to distant movement. It continues in the same quiet rhythm. And yet, despite this lack of action, it still feels significant. This is the paradox. How can something have such presence without control? The answer does not come from what the giant does. It comes from what it does not do. It does not waste movement. It does not impose itself. It does not attempt to shape the world around it. It allows the world to remain as it is, and in doing so, it becomes part of that world so completely that its presence feels natural, unforced. If you were to compare this to the surface, the difference would be immediate. Above, movement is constant. Creatures react quickly. They compete for space, for food, for position. Presence is often tied to action. The more something does, the more visible it becomes. But here, visibility is rare. Action is minimal, and presence comes from something else entirely. It comes from continuity, from existing within the same space, without disruption. The giant does not need to announce itself. It does not need to prove anything. It simply continues. And that continuity, over time, becomes its identity. If you remain still, if you do not try to follow too closely, you may notice something else. The giant begins to disappear, not because it has left, but because your perception changes again. Its movement becomes so slow, so aligned with the surrounding water, that it blends back into the environment. The edges soften, the form fades, and once again, there is only darkness. But now, it feels different because you know something is there. even if you cannot see it. This is a different kind of awareness, not based on sight, not based on clear signals, but on subtle shifts, on the understanding that presence does not always need to be visible. In this world, to exist is enough. There is no need to dominate in order to be real, no need to control in order to matter. The giant does not rule, but it shapes the experience of the space simply by being part of it. And perhaps that is a different kind of power, one that does not rely on force, one that does not create resistance, one that does not leave traces behind. If you think about it, this kind of presence is almost invisible. It does not draw attention. It does not demand recognition, and yet it cannot be ignored, because once you become aware of it, it changes how you see everything else. The space is no longer empty. The stillness is no longer absolute. There is life here, moving in ways that do not disrupt but still exist. And within that realization, the idea of control begins to feel unnecessary, because nothing here is trying to take more than it needs. Nothing is trying to expand beyond its limits. Everything remains within a quiet balance. The giant is not above this balance. It is part of it, and that is why it does not rule, because there is nothing here that needs to be ruled. Only a world that continues exactly as it is, with or without anything at the top. And as the giant fades once more into the darkness, you are left with something that is difficult to describe. Not absence, not emptiness, but a kind of presence that remains even when nothing can be seen. A reminder that in this place, existence itself is enough. A world without a king. If you remain here just a little longer, something begins to settle, not in the water, not in the creatures around you, but in the way you understand this place. At first, it felt unfamiliar, too quiet, too empty, too distant from anything you recognize. There were no clear patterns to follow, no obvious structure to hold on to, and so your mind tried to fill in the gaps. It searched for something familiar, a center, a system, a sense of order, because that is what we are used to. We look for leaders. We look for dominance. We look for something that defines everything else. But the longer you stay here, the more that instinct begins to fade, not because it is wrong, but because it does not apply. This world does not organize itself in that way. There is no single point where everything gathers, no place where activity becomes concentrated. If you drift in one direction, you may encounter life. If you drift in another, there may be nothing for a long time. There is no guarantee, no pattern that repeats in a predictable way, only distance, only separation. And within that separation, something unexpected appears. Independence. Each creature exists on its own, not as part of a group, not within a system of roles, but as an individual response to the same environment. They do not follow each other. They do not move together. They do not build anything that lasts beyond the moment. If two creatures meet, it is not because they belong together. It is because their paths have crossed briefly, and then they separate again. There is no attempt to maintain the connection. No need to stay, because staying would require energy, and energy is not something to be spent lightly here. So even encounters are temporary moments of overlap in a vast, continuous space. If you were expecting something like a hierarchy, you would not find it. There is no chain of command, no structure that determines who comes first and who follows. Even size does not create authority. The giants you have seen do not gather others around them. They do not lead. They do not protect. They do not command. They pass through just like everything else. And when they are gone, nothing changes. The space does not belong to them. It never did. This is where something becomes clear. There is no king here, not because one has not claimed the role, but because the role itself does not exist. There is nothing to rule, nothing to organize, nothing to control. The environment is too vast, too constant, too indifferent. It does not respond to power. It does not shift based on presence. It simply remains, and everything within it must adapt, not to each other, but to it. The pressure does not change for any creature. The cold does not lessen. The darkness does not lift. These are the only true constants, the only forces that shape behavior, and they do so equally, without preference, without variation. In a world like this, what would a ruler even change? There is no resource to control, no territory that can be held, no advantage that can be maintained over time. Everything moves slowly but continuously. Water shifts, particles fall, creatures drift in and out of proximity. Even if something attempted to establish control, it would dissolve, not through conflict, but through the nature of the environment itself. So, instead of hierarchy, there is something else, a quiet balance, not enforced, not designed, but emerging naturally from limitation. Each creature takes only what it needs, not out of choice, but because taking more is not possible. Each movement is measured not by rule, but by consequence. If you move too much, you lose energy. If you react too quickly, you spend more than you gain. There is no punishment, only outcome. And over time, that outcome shapes everything. This creates a kind of order, but it is not visible. It does not look like structure. It does not resemble systems we understand. It is subtle, almost invisible. A shared understanding without communication. A pattern that exists without being defined. If you stay still, if you allow your attention to soften, you may begin to feel it, not as something you can see, but as something you sense. A quiet agreement between everything that lives here, not to dominate, not to expand, but simply to continue. And in that continuation, there is no need for a king, because nothing is trying to rise above anything else. Nothing is trying to control more than its place. Everything remains within the same quiet boundaries. Even the giants, they do not stand apart. They do not exist above the rest. They are subject to the same conditions, the same limits, the same slow rhythm of existence. Their size does not free them. It only changes how they move within those limits. If anything, it makes them more careful, more restrained, because they have more to sustain. And so they become part of the same balance, not above it, not outside it, within it. This is what makes this world feel so different. Not the darkness, not the cold, but the absence of something we expect to find. No competition for position, no struggle for dominance, no rise to power, only presence, only survival, only continuation. And as that realization settles, something else begins to change. The need to understand this place in familiar terms begins to fade. You no longer look for structure. You no longer expect hierarchy. You stop asking, who is in control? because the question itself no longer fit. There is no answer here, only a different way of existing. One that does not require a center, one that does not depend on leadership, one that continues without ever needing to be defined. And in that quiet understanding, the world begins to feel complete, not lacking, not unfinished, but whole in a way that does not need anything at the top. So as you drift through this vast, silent space, you may begin to notice something unexpected, that the absence of a king is not a flaw. It is the reason this world works at all, because nothing here is trying to control what cannot be controlled. Nothing is trying to shape what is already balanced. Everything simply exists within the same quiet limits. And that is enough, more than enough, because in a place like this, to continue is the only form of success that matters, and no king is required for that to happen. The slow hunt begins. If you have been drifting here for a while, you may have started to notice something unusual. There is life, but very little movement. Creatures exist, but they do not behave the way you expect. Nothing seems to be chasing anything. Nothing appears to be hunting. And yet, life continues, which means something must be feeding. Somewhere in this vast, silent world, there is a process that allows creatures to survive, but it does not look like what we know. On land, hunting is often easy to recognize. There is motion, speed, a clear moment. When one creature pursues another, there is tension and then release, a beginning and an end. But here, that pattern disappears. The deeper you remain, the more difficult it becomes to tell when anything is actually happening. At first, it feels like nothing is. The water remains still. The creatures drift. Time stretches. And then, slowly, something begins to reveal itself. Not through action, but through patience. A giant appears again. You may not notice it immediately. It does not arrive with purpose. It does not scan its surroundings in any obvious way. It simply exists in a slightly different position than before. If you try to follow it, you may lose track of it because it does not move in a straight line. It does not rush toward anything. It adjusts, small changes in direction, barely noticeable shift. And yet, over time, those shifts matter because they place the creature in a path where something might appear. This is where the idea of hunting begins to change. The giant is not searching in the way we understand. It is aligning, positioning itself within the flow of the environment, waiting for the world to bring something within reach. If you continue to observe, you may begin to see it more clearly. There are moments, long and quiet, when nothing happens, and then, very subtly, a response. Not a sudden movement, not a burst of speed, just a slight adjustment, a gentle opening, a shift that suggests something has entered its awareness. But what is that awareness? There is no light to see clearly, no wide field of vision. The giant does not rely on sight alone. It senses. The water carries information, tiny changes in pressure, subtle disturbances in flow, the presence of another living form, even before it can be seen. And so the giant waits, not passively, but attentively. Its stillness is not emptiness, it is focus. Every part of its body tuned to the smallest signal, because here, signals are rare, and when they appear, they matter. If you remain with it, if you do not rush ahead, you may begin to notice the moment when something enters its range. It is not obvious. There is no clear outline, only a faint change. change, a slight difference in how the water moves. Something small, drifting, unaware. The giant does not react immediately. It does not lunge. It does not chase. It allows the distance to close on its own. This is the difference. In the world above, hunters close the distance. Here, the distance closes itself. Time becomes part of the process. Waiting becomes part of the strategy. And when the moment finally arrives, it is almost invisible. A small movement, a quiet action, and then stillness again. If you are not watching carefully, you might miss it entirely. There is no struggle, no extended chase, no visible conflict, only a brief interaction, and then nothing. The giant remains. The water returns to its slow rhythm, and whatever entered that space is no longer there. This is hunting here. Not dramatic, not fast, but precise. Every action reduced to its simplest form, because anything more would be too costly. If you consider how little exists here, this begins to make sense. There is no guarantee of another opportunity, no assurance that food will appear again soon. So each moment must be enough. And because of that, the giant does not rely on strength alone. It relies on timing, on placement, on understanding the environment better than anything else around it. It becomes part of the flow, not separate from it, not acting against it, but moving within it so naturally that the difference between creature and environment begins to fade. If you stay long enough, you may begin to feel that shift yourself. The water no longer seems empty. It becomes a space filled with possibility, not constant activity, but quiet potential. Something could appear at any moment, and yet there is no urgency, because urgency would break the balance. The giant understands this. It does not rush toward the future. It allows the present to unfold, and within that unfolding, it finds what it needs. Not always, not easily, but enough to continue. And that is all that matters here. As you drift beside it, you may begin to notice how different this feels. From everything you have known, there is no excitement, no sudden rise in tension, only a slow awareness that something is happening, even when it looks like nothing is. This is the beginning of the hunt, not a moment of action, but a state of being. A quiet readiness that never fully disappears, because in this world, the hunt does not begin when something appears. It is always present in the stillness, in the waiting, in the careful positioning of a creature that understands that survival does not come from speed, but from patience. And as the giant continues, unchanged in its rhythm, you begin to understand something deeper, that here to hunt is not to pursue, it is to remain, to exist in the right place at the right time, and to take only what comes within reach. Nothing more, nothing less. And in that quiet precision, life continues without urgency, without excess, only through the slow, almost invisible process of waiting until the moment arrives. When the giant is the trap. If you continue to drift alongside the giant, something else begins to reveal itself. Not in sudden action, not in visible effort, but in the way the creature exists within the space around it. At first, it still feels like waiting. The same slow rhythm, the same careful stillness. Nothing appears to change. And yet, if you remain long enough, you may begin to notice a subtle difference. The giant is not just waiting for something to come close. It is becoming something that draws life in, not through force, not through movement, but through presence. There is a quiet shift in the water around it, not strong enough to be called a current, not clear enough to be seen directly, but enough to alter the path of what drifts nearby. Tiny particles begin to move slightly differently. Their slow descent changes direction just enough. If something small passes at a distance, it does not continue in a straight line. It curves gently, almost imperceptibly, as if the space itself is guiding it. This is not an accident. The giant does not create large movements. It does not push the water outward. Instead, its size alone becomes a factor, a presence that reshapes flow without intention, that we can easily recognize. And within that reshaping, something important happens. The giant becomes part of the environment, not separate, not acting against it, but integrated into it so completely that it no longer needs to chase anything at all. If you think of a trap, you may imagine something hidden, something designed to capture when a creature steps too close. But here, the trap is not something placed. It is something that exists. The giant itself is the trap, not because it is aggressive, not because it is waiting to strike, but because everything that passes near it enters a space that has already been altered, a space where escape becomes less likely without ever feeling impossible. If you watch closely, you may begin to notice the pattern. Small organisms drifting through the dark, unaware. Their movement is slow, determined more by the water than by themselves. They do not see danger in the way we understand it. There is no clear outline to avoid, no sudden signal, only the same darkness they have always known. And then they move closer. The change is subtle, a slight slowing, a gentle shift in direction. Nothing alarming, nothing that demands reaction. And that is what makes it work. Because in this world, reaction is costly. To react too quickly, to move without reason, would use energy that cannot be easily replaced. So most creatures do not react unless they must. And by the time they must, it is already too late. The giant does not rush to meet them. It does not accelerate. It allows the distance to disappear naturally. And when the moment arrives, it does so without disruption. A small opening, a movement so controlled, it barely disturbs the water around it. And then stillness. Again, the space returns to what it was. The flow continues. Nothing has changed, except that something is no longer there. If you were not watching closely, you might not even realize what happened. There is no visible aftermath, no sign of struggle, only absence. This is the nature of the trap here. It does not announce itself. It does not leave evidence. It simply exists as part of the environment. And because of that, it is almost impossible to avoid. If you remain with this idea, you may begin to see something deeper. The giant is not separate from the hunt. It is the hunt. Its body, its stillness, its relationship with the water, all of it works together to create a condition where survival becomes possible, not through effort, but through alignment. This is very different from what we expect. We imagine strength as action. We imagine success as something that is taken. But here, success is something that is received only when conditions are right, only when everything aligns. And that alignment takes time, which is why patience becomes the most important trait. The giant does not hurry the process. It does not force the moment to happen. It waits, not passively, but precisely. holding its position, maintaining its presence, allowing the environment to continue until something enters the space it has already shaped. If nothing comes, it continues. There is no frustration, no urgency, because this is not a world where outcomes can be controlled. Only conditions can be maintained, and so the giant maintains them quietly, consistently, without deviation. If you stay long enough, you may begin to feel how complete this system is. Nothing extra, nothing unnecessary, no wasted motion. The creature does not need to do more because it has already become exactly what it needs to be. A presence that draws life close without ever chasing it. A form that exists within the flow so naturally that the flow itself becomes part of its survival. And in that realization, the idea of hunting changes again. It is no longer about action. It is about position, no longer about force, but about integration. The giant does not conquer its environment. It becomes indistinguishable from it. And in doing so, it gains something far more effective than control. It gains inevitability, because anything that enters that space is already part of what will happen next, not through intention, not through design, but through the quiet, continuous alignment between creature and world. And as the giant remains unchanged in its stillness, you begin to understand something that is easy to miss, that the most effective form of survival here is not to move toward life, but to become the place where life eventually arrives. When the hunt fails. If you remain here long enough, watching the slow rhythm of this world, you may begin to notice something that feels unexpected. Not every moment leads to success. Not every alignment becomes an outcome. There are long stretches where nothing happens at all. The giant continues, holding its position, maintaining its quiet presence. The water flows around it, unchanged. Particles drift, falling slowly from above, but nothing enters its reach. Nothing crosses the invisible space where action would occur, and so nothing happens. At first, this might feel like absence, like something is missing, because in the world we know, effort is often followed by result. If something hunts, we expect it to find something. If it waits, we expect that waiting to lead somewhere. But here, that expectation begins to fade. Waiting does not guarantee anything. Positioning does not promise an outcome. The giant may remain for a long time in the exact place it has chosen, and still nothing arrives. If you continue to observe, you may begin to feel the length of that time, not measured in seconds or minutes, but in the quiet continuation of stillness. There is no sign that the creature is becoming restless, no change in its behavior, no sudden decision to move quickly and search elsewhere. It simply remains, because here, movement itself carries risk. To leave a position that might eventually bring something, for the uncertainty of another place would cost more than it might return. So the giant stays, even when nothing happens, even when the space remains empty. This is a different kind of patience, not waiting for a known event, but existing without expectation. If something comes, it will respond. If nothing comes, it will continue. There is no frustration in that, because frustration would change nothing. It would not create food. It would not alter the flow of the environment. It would only waste energy, and energy is the one thing that cannot be wasted here. If you stay with the giant through these long, quiet stretches, you may begin to notice something subtle It does not weaken. It does not collapse from the absence of food, because its life is not built on constant intake. It is built on endurance, the ability to continue even when nothing is gained. This is something that feels unfamiliar. Above, life often depends on regular cycles. Food is found, energy is restored, the process repeats. But here, the cycle stretches. There are moments of intake and long periods without, and those long periods are expected. They are part of the design. If the giant succeeds once, that success must last, not for a short time, but for a long one. Its body holds what it needs and uses it carefully. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is consumed faster than necessary. And so even when the hunt fails, life does not end. It simply continues at the same slow pace. If you watch closely, you may notice that failure does not look like failure here. There is no visible sign, no collapse, no clear indication that something went wrong, because nothing did, nothing arrived, and that is not an error. It is simply the condition of this world. The giant does not measure success the way we do. It does not compare one moment to the next. It does not expect balance. It exists within whatever occurs. If something comes, it takes it. If nothing comes, it remains. There is no need to label one as success and the other as failure, because both are part of the same process. If you remain long enough, this begins to feel natural. The absence of action no longer feels empty. It becomes a kind of presence, a quiet continuation that does not need to change. And within that continuation, the giant endures. Time passes, not in visible shifts, not in clear transitions, but in the steady persistence of existence itself. Then, without warning, something changes. A small disturbance, a slight variation in the water, a signal so faint it could easily be missed. But the giant responds, not dramatically, not immediately, just enough, a small adjustment, a shift in orientation, the same pattern as before, the same slow alignment, and once again, the possibility returns, not because the creature forced it, but because the environment allowed it. This is how the hunt continues, not as a series of victories, but as a sequence of conditions, some leading to nothing, some leading to something, all of them necessary. If you stay with this understanding, you may begin to see something deeper. That survival here is not built on winning. It is built on lasting. The giant does not need to succeed often. It only needs to succeed enough. Enough to continue. Enough to remain. And because its life is structured around that idea, failure becomes less important. It does not define the creature. It does not interrupt its existence. It simply becomes part of the rhythm, a rhythm that does not rush, does not react, does not demand more than the environment can give. And in that rhythm, there is a kind of quiet strength, not the strength of action, but the strength of persistence, the ability to remain unchanged even when nothing happens. And as you drift beside the giant through these long stretches of stillness, you begin to understand something that is easy to overlook, that here, the absence of success is not the end of the hunt. It is part of it, because the hunt never truly stops. It simply continues through time, waiting for the moment when the world once again brings something close enough to matter. A hunt without ending. If you remain here through these long stretches of waiting, through moments where something happens and moments where nothing does, a quiet realization begins to take shape. The hunt never really ends. At first, it may have seemed like a series of moments, a beginning when something enters the space, an action when the giant responds, an ending when the water returns to stillness. But the longer you stay, the more those boundaries begin to dissolve, because even when nothing is happening, the conditions of the hunt are still there. The giant remains in position. The water continues to move. Particles drift downward, slow and constant. Signals pass through the darkness, unseen but present. Everything that allows the hunt to happen is already in place. Nothing needs to begin. Nothing needs to be triggered. It simply continues. If you watch the giant now, you may notice how little has changed. Its movement is the same. Its stillness is the same. There is no shift in behavior between moments of action and moments of quiet, because for the giant, there is no difference. It does not separate time into parts. It does not recognize a start or an end. There is only one continuous state: awareness, presence, readiness that never fully disappears. Even when nothing enters its reach, it remains, not waiting for something to happen, but existing in a way where something can happen at any time. This is what makes the hunt here feel so different. It is not an event. It is a condition, a state that continues whether or not anything changes. If something drifts too close, the state expresses itself. If nothing arrives, the state remains unchanged. This creates a kind of quiet tension, not sharp, not immediate, but constant, a background presence that never fully fades. If you allow yourself to feel it, it is always there, not overwhelming, not demanding attention, but persistent, because at any moment something could enter the space. At any moment the stillness could shift, and yet most of the time it does not. Most of the time the water continues without interruption. The giant remains without movement, and the hunt continues without outcome. This is where something deeper begins to emerge. The giant does not hunt because it is hungry in a moment. It hunts because it must always be ready. Hunger here is not sudden. It does not arrive in waves. It exists quietly in the background, a constant condition that never fully disappears. And so the response to it is constant as well. Not urgent, not reactive, but sustained. The giant does not wait until it needs food to begin hunting. It exists in a way where the hunt is always possible, because the cost of becoming unprepared is too high. If it were to relax completely, if it were to drift without awareness, the moment could pass. And in a world where moments are rare, that loss could last a long time. So the giant remains as it is, not tense, not alert in the way we understand it, but aligned. Every part of its existence already positioned within the process. If you stay long enough, this begins to feel natural. The idea of a beginning becomes unnecessary. The idea of an ending fades. There is only continuation, a quiet flow where presence and possibility exist together, and within that flow, the giant moves, not forward, not towards something specific, but within the same space where everything is already happening. If you look closely, you may notice something else. Even when the giant is not feeding, it is still shaping the environment. The water moves differently around it. The paths of drifting particles shift. The space remains influenced, even in stillness, which means the hunt is not just about moments of action. It is about everything that leads to those moments, everything that exists before and after. There is no separation, only one continuous process. And in that process, time feels different. It does not move in clear segments. It stretches, expands, allows long periods of stillness to exist without meaning loss. If you bring your awareness back to yourself, you may notice something similar. Your sense of urgency begins to soften. The need for something to happen begins to fade. You are no longer waiting for a moment. You are simply present within it, and in that presence, the hunt feels less like an action and more like a condition of being. This is what allows life to continue here. Not speed, not strength, but continuity. The ability to remain within the same state for as long as necessary, without change, without interruption, until something enters the space. And when it does, the response is immediate, not because it was prepared in that moment, but because it was always prepared. And then, just as quietly, the moment passes, the water returns, the stillness resumes. Nothing appears different, and yet the process continues, unbroken. If you remain here at the edge of that understanding, you may begin to feel something difficult to describe, that in this world, the hunt is not something that happens. It is something that always is, a quiet, continuous presence woven into the existence of everything that lives here, without beginning, without ending, only continuation. And as the giant drifts once more, unchanged in its rhythm, you begin to understand something that is easy to miss. That survival in this place does not depend on winning a moment. It depends on never leaving the state where survival remains possible. And that state, once entered, never truly disappears. When giants cross paths, if you continue drifting here through the long, quiet stretches of this world, you may begin to feel as though everything exists alone. Each creature moving within its own space, each presence separated by distance that rarely closes, encounters a brief, rare, and often unnoticed. Most of the time, nothing intersects. Paths remain apart, lives unfold without ever touching. And because of that, it is easy to believe that nothing here truly meets. But that is not entirely true. There are moments, very rare ones, when distance disappears. Not suddenly, not in a way that draws attention, but slowly, so slowly that if you are not watching carefully, you might not notice until it has already happened. If you remain still, if you allow your awareness to soften into the space around you, you may begin to sense it. A change, not in the giant you have been following, but in the water beyond it. A second presence. At first, it is only a suggestion, a faint shift in the way particles move, a subtle difference in the darkness ahead. Nothing clearly defined, nothing that can be seen with certainty. And yet, something feels different. If you continue to observe, the shape becomes clearer. Another giant, not identical, not mirrored, but similar in scale. Another form, moving slowly through the same vast space. For a long moment, nothing happens. The two remain distant, separated by water that still feels endless. There is no change in speed, no sign that either creature has noticed the other, and yet the distance continues to close. lives, not because either one is moving toward the other, but because their paths have aligned. Two trajectories formed independently, now intersecting. If you think about how rare this is, it begins to feel almost impossible. A world this large, a space this empty, and yet, for a brief moment, two giants share the same path. As they draw closer, something subtle begins to shift, not in the water, not in the environment, but in the way the space feels. There is a quiet tension, not sharp, not urgent, but present, because now there is more than one presence, more than one form, in a space that is usually defined by separation. If you expect something dramatic, you may be surprised. There is no sudden reaction, no acceleration, no attempt to dominate or escape. Both creatures continue as they were, slow, measured, unchanged, and yet something has changed because awareness does not require visible action. It exists quietly beneath movement. If you watch closely, you may notice small adjustments, a slight shift in orientation, a barely visible change in direction. Not enough to create distance, not enough to signal avoidance, but enough to acknowledge that something else is there. This is not confrontation, not in the way we understand it. There is no claim of territory, no display of strength, because here there is nothing to defend, nothing to compete over, only space, only existence. And so the encounter unfolds in a different way. The two giants move closer, gradually, the distance narrowing without urgency, until finally they share the same space. For a brief moment, they are near enough that their presence overlaps. The water between them becomes shared. Their influence on the environment intersects, and still there is no conflict, no sudden change, only coexistence. If you remain with this moment, you may begin to feel how unusual it is, not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing does. Two large forms, two independent lives, crossing paths in a world that rarely allows such contact. And yet, there is no need to act, no need to prove, no need to establish anything beyond what already is. They do not stop, they do not circle, they do not engage, they continue, each one maintaining its own rhythm, its own path, even as those paths briefly become one. And then, just as quietly as it began, the moment passes, the distance increases again, not through effort, not through decision, but through continuation, each giant moving forward within its own direction. The shared space dissolves, the water returns to separation, and once again there is distance. If you look back, there is no sign that anything happened, no trace, no change in the environment, only memory, a brief overlap in an otherwise endless expanse. And as you remain there, watching the space return to its quiet isolation, you may begin to understand something that is easy to miss, that even here, in a world defined by distance, connection does exist, but it is not held, it is not sustained, it does not form structure. It appears for a moment and then disappears, and perhaps that is all it needs to be. Not a system, not a bond, just a crossing, a quiet intersection between two lives that continue without needing anything more. And as the giant you have followed fades once more into the darkness, you are left with the space between things, wide, silent, unchanged, as if the encounter itself was never meant to last, only to happen once and then become part of the quiet continuity of everything that exists here. The space between them. If you remain here in the quiet moment after the two giants have crossed paths, you may begin to notice something that is difficult to describe. Not the creatures themselves. They are already moving apart, their forms becoming softer, less defined as distance slowly returns. But something remains, a feeling within the space they just shared. It is not visible. There is no change in the water that you can clearly see. The currents continue as they always have. Particles drift downward without interruption, and yet the space feels different, as if something passed through it that has not completely disappeared. If you focus on that space, not on the creatures, but on what lies between them, you begin to notice how delicate it is. For a brief moment, that space held two presences, two large forms, existing close enough to influence one another, not through force, not through action, but through proximity. And now that proximity is gone, but the awareness of it remains. This is where something subtle begins to emerge. The space between things is not empty. It carries memory, not in the way we remember events, but in the way conditions linger. The water has returned to its slow, steady movement, but the understanding that something was there does not vanish as quickly. If you continue to observe, you may begin to notice how rare that moment was in a world this vast, where distance defines everything. Two giants sharing the same space is not something that happens often. Most of the time, nothing overlaps, nothing intersects. Each life unfolds in its own quiet path, and because of that, the space between them is usually untouched, unshared. But for a brief moment, it was not, and that changes how it feels. Even now, as the distance grows again, you may still sense the quiet tension that was there. Not conflict, not danger, but awareness, the recognition of another presence. If you think about it, this is the closest thing to interaction that exists here. Not sustained, not repeated, just a moment where two paths cross, and within that moment, something shifts, not in behavior, not in outcome, but in possibility. Because when two giants are near, something could happen, not necessarily, not often, but the possibility exists. And that possibility creates a kind of tension, not sharp, not immediate, but present. If you stay with that feeling, you may begin to notice how it fades slowly, gradually, as the distance returns, as the two creatures move further apart. The space expands again, the overlap disappears, and once more, everything becomes separate, independent, isolated, as it was before. But now, you understand something different, that the absence of interaction is not the only state that exists here. There are moments, however rare, when things come close, when presence overlap, when awareness extends beyond a single form. And then those moments end, not through conflict, not through decision, but through continuation. Each creature moving forward within its own path, without holding on to what just occurred. This is what makes this world feel so quiet. Not because nothing happens, but because nothing lingers. There are no lasting connections, no structures built from repeated encounters, no systems formed from interaction, only moments appearing and then dissolving. If you remain here in the space that has now returned to its usual stillness, you may begin to feel how complete that stillness is. Not broken, not interrupted, only briefly shared and then restored. And within that restoration, there is no need for anything more. No need for the creatures to return to one another. No need for the moment to repeat, because repetition is not part of this world, only continuation. The giants do not seek each other. They do not follow. They do not remember in the way we do. They continue, and that is enough. If you look once more into the distance, you may still catch a faint suggestion of one of them, a shape barely visible, fading into the darkness, the other already gone, and between them only space, wide, silent, unchanged, as if nothing ever occupied it. And yet, you know that it did. For a moment, it held something rare, something that does not stay, something that does not return, only a crossing, only a brief alignment between two separate lives. And now it is gone, leaving behind nothing but the quiet understanding that even in a world defined by distance, there are moments when that distance disappears, just long enough to be noticed, and then long enough to fade again. The moment that could become conflict. If you remain here in the quiet memory of where the two giants once crossed, you may begin to sense something deeper, not something that happened, but something that could have. Because when two presences come close, there is always a possibility, not visible, not certain, but present. The possibility of change, the possibility that the quiet balance might shift. If you return your attention to that moment when the distance between them was smallest, you may begin to notice how delicate it was. Two large forms, two independent lives, close enough to influence one another, and yet nothing happened. But why? If you are used to the world above, you might expect something different, a reaction, a movement, a test of strength. Because when large creatures meet, conflict often follows, not always, but often enough that we begin to expect it. But here, that expectation does not hold, not because conflict is impossible, but because it is unnecessary. And more than that, it is expensive. If one giant were to engage the other, to move suddenly, to attempt control, it would spend energy, a great deal of it. And in this world, energy is not easily replaced. There is no guarantee that what is spent can be recovered. So before any action occurs, something else takes place. A quiet evaluation, not conscious in the way we understand, not a decision formed in thought, but a response built into existence itself. Each creature senses the other, not through sight alone, but through presence, through the way the water changes, through the subtle signals that travel through the environment. And in that sensing, something becomes clear. There is no advantage here, no immediate gain, no reason to turn this moment into something more. So the possibility of conflict remains only a possibility. It does not become reality. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how close it came. Not close in distance, but close in condition. Everything needed for conflict was present. Two large bodies, shared space, awareness, and yet nothing moved beyond that. The moment held itself at the edge of something that never fully formed. This is what makes it so difficult to notice, because we are used to outcomes. We are used to events that resolve themselves. Something happens, and then it is over. But here, the moment does not resolve. It dissolves slowly, without conclusion, without change. If you imagine that same moment again, you may begin to see how easily it could have been different. a slightly closer distance, a slightly different movement, a shift that brings one creature into the direct path of the other. And then something might happen, a response, a reaction, a brief exchange of force. But even then, it would not last, because even conflict here must be brief. Anything longer would cost too much. So even in the rare case where two giants do interact, it would not resemble what we expect. No prolonged struggle, no sustained dominance, only a moment, a quick adjustment, and then separation again. But most of the time, even that does not occur, because the conditions do not favor it. The environment itself discourages escalation, not through resistance, but through limitation. There is not enough here to justify conflict, not enough food, not enough energy, not enough reason. So the moment remains at the edge, never crossing into action. If you remain here, feeling that quiet edge, you may begin to understand something subtle, that the absence of conflict is not weakness, it is precision, a perfect alignment between behavior and environment. Nothing happens because nothing needs to, and that is enough. If you continue to follow the fading paths of the two giants, you may notice how completely they have returned to their own existence. No sign that they remember the moment, no change in their movement, no adjustment in their rhythm, as if the possibility never mattered, as if it was always meant to pass without consequence. And yet, for you, it remains a quiet awareness that something could have happened, that beneath the stillness, there is always potential, not for chaos, not for disruption, but for change, a change that rarely comes, because everything here is balanced just enough to prevent it. And so the moment becomes something else, not an event, not a memory, but a threshold, a place where something could begin, but does not. And in that restraint, there is a kind of quiet power, more subtle than action, more lasting than outcome, because it does not disturb what already works. It allows the world to remain as it is, unbroken, unchanged. And as the last trace of that shared moment fades into the surrounding darkness, you are left with something that is easy to overlook, that in this world, the greatest action is often the one that never happens. They do not stay. If you remain here after the moment has passed, after the possibility of something more has quietly dissolved, you may begin to notice what does not happen next. The two giants do not return. They do not slow down to remain within the same space. They do not circle back to observe one another. They do not linger. Each continues as if the encounter was never meant to be held. At first, this may feel unusual, because in the world we know, when two paths cross, something often follows. A reaction, a memory, a change in direction, something that extends beyond the moment itself. But here, nothing extends. The moment ends, and that is enough. If you follow the giant you have been observing, you may notice how completely it returns to its original rhythm. Its movement does not change. Its pace remains the same. There is no sign that anything has influenced it. No hesitation, no shift, only continuation, as if the encounter never required acknowledgement. And in a way, it did not, because here there is nothing to gain from staying, no structure to build, no relationship to maintain, no advantage in remaining close. To stay would mean to remain within the same space to share conditions that are not meant to be shared for long. And sharing space costs energy. Even if nothing happens, even if there is no conflict, presence alone requires adjustment, awareness, subtle responses to another form. And over time, those small adjustments become too much. So the most efficient path is separation, not forced, not deliberate, but natural. Each creature continues within its own direction, allowing distance to return, allowing space to expand again. If you look back to where they once crossed, there is nothing there now, no trace, no sign that two large forms once occupied the same place. The water flows as it always has. Particles drift downward without interruption. The environment remains unchanged. It does not hold the moment. It does not record it. It simply continues. And because of that, the creatures within it do the same. They do not carry the past forward. They do not return to what has already occurred. They move into what comes next, even if what comes next is identical to what came before. This is what makes this world feel so quiet, not because nothing happens, but because nothing is kept. Moments do not accumulate. They do not build into something larger. They appear and then they disappear, leaving nothing behind. If you remain here, you may begin to feel how complete that absence is. There is no need for repetition, no need for reinforcement, no need for connection beyond the moment itself, because the moment is already enough. And once it has passed, there is no reason to return to it. If you follow the path of the giant once more, you may notice how easily it disappears into the darkness, its form becoming softer, less distinct, until eventually it is no longer visible at all. And yet it continues somewhere beyond perception, moving within the same slow rhythm, the same quiet process, unchanged. The other giant has already done the same, gone not in a sudden way, but gradually as distance reclaims the space between them. And once again, there is only separation, only vastness, only the quiet continuation of everything that exists alone. If you stay with that feeling, you may begin to understand something that is easy to miss, that this is not loneliness, not in the way we think of it, because nothing here is expecting connection. Nothing is waiting for something to return. Each life exists exactly as it needs to, within its own path, within its own rhythm. And that is enough, more than enough. Because in a place like this, to remain separate is not a loss, it is balance. It allows everything to continue without interference, without disruption, without the need to hold on to anything that has already passed. And so the giants do not stay, not because they cannot, but because there is no reason to. The moment has already happened. The space has already been shared. And now it returns to what it always was, open, empty, unclaimed, as if nothing ever needed to remain. And as you drift once more through that quiet, endless space, you begin to feel how natural that is, how complete, that nothing here holds on, nothing returns, nothing repeats, only the slow, steady movement forward into a darkness that does not remember and does not need to. And within that darkness, everything continues exactly as it is, without pause, without attachment, only presence, moving through a world where nothing ever stays. Why they do not fight. If you remain here after watching the giants cross paths, silence, after feeling the quiet tension that never became conflict, a question may begin to form, not loudly, not urgently, but slowly. Why did nothing happen? Why did two creatures, large enough to influence everything around them, choose not to engage? If you bring with you everything you know from the world above, this may feel incomplete, because where there is size, there is often competition. Where there is strength, there is often conflict. And when two large presences meet, there is usually a moment where one tests the other. But here, that moment does not unfold, not because it cannot, but because it does not need to. If you look closely at this world, you begin to see something fundamental. There is very little to fight over, no fixed territory that can be claimed and held, no stable resource that exists in one place long enough to defend. Food does not gather here. It does not remain. It drifts slowly, constantly, without belonging to any one location, which means there is nothing to protect, nothing that can be controlled for long. If a creature were to claim a space, that space would not stay the same. The currents would shift, the particles would move. What was once present would disappear, and what arrives next would not be predictable. So holding ground has no meaning. There is no advantage in staying in one place and defending it, because what you defend will not remain. If you follow that idea further, another question begins to fade. Who would be stronger? Because strength in this world does not operate the same way. It is not about overpowering another creature. It is not about winning a direct encounter, because even if one creature could dominate another, what would it gain? Very little. A brief outcome, a small advantage that would not last, and in exchange, a great cost. Movement. Yes, as in energy, risk, all of which matter far more here than any short-term gain. If you consider the cost carefully, you begin to see why conflict does not emerge. To engage another giant would require movement beyond the ordinary, a shift from stillness into action, a use of energy that has not been planned. And once that energy is spent, there is no guarantee it can be replaced soon. The environment does not provide on demand. It does not respond to effort. It does not reward aggression. It remains unchanged. So any creature that chooses conflict takes a risk that may extend far beyond the moment. A single unnecessary action could create a deficit that lasts a long time. And in a place where survival depends on careful balance, that risk is rarely worth taking. So the decision is not made in the moment. It is built into behavior itself. Avoid what is unnecessary. Preserve what you have. Do not engage unless there is no other option. And most of the time, there is always another option. Distance, space, continuation. If you think back to the moment when the two giants met, you may begin to see it differently now. It was not a missed opportunity. It was not hesitation. It was alignment. Both creatures existing within the same set of conditions, both responding in the same way, not because they recognize each other, but because they recognize the environment. And within that environment, conflict does not fit. It does not belong. It does not serve survival. So it does not occur. If you remain with this understanding, you may begin to feel how complete it is. Nothing is forcing peace. Nothing is preventing action. There is no rule, no system, no structure enforcing behavior. Only consequence, only the quiet understanding that what is spent must be recovered, and what cannot be recovered must not be spent This is what replaces conflict, not cooperation, not agreement, but restraint, a form of balance that emerges naturally from limitation. If you look again into the space where encounters happen, you may begin to notice how calm it remains, not empty, not lifeless, but undisturbed, because nothing here is trying to take more than it needs. Nothing is trying to expand beyond its place. Everything remains within a quiet boundary, not defined by territory, not marked by lines, but understood, felt. If you stay with this feeling, you may begin to realize something subtle, that this world is not lacking conflict. It has simply moved beyond it, not through choice, but through necessity. Conflict exists as a possibility, but it rarely becomes reality, because reality here is shaped by something else, something slower, something quieter, a constant balance between what is needed and what can be sustained. And within that balance, even the largest giants move without fighting, not because they are peaceful, but because they are precise. Every action measured, every movement considered, every moment aligned with what allows life to continue. And as you drift here, within that quiet understanding, the absence of conflict no longer feels surprising. It feels inevitable, because in a place where nothing is wasted, even the idea of fighting becomes something that simply does not belong. What they compete for instead. If you remain here with the understanding that these giants do not fight, another question may begin to rise quietly, almost unnoticed. If they do not compete through force, then what do they compete for? Because even in a world this calm, existence still requires something: energy, sustenance, a way to continue. And those things are not unlimited. They drift, they appear, they disappear. And so, even without conflict, there is still competition, but it does not look the way you expect. There are no sudden movements, no chasing, no attempt to take from another creature. Instead, competition happens in silence, in timing, in position, in patience. If you follow a giant through this space, you may begin to notice how carefully it moves, not randomly, not without direction, but with a quiet awareness of where it is and what might come next. Because in this world, food does not stay still. It falls slowly from above. Fragments of life that once existed in the light, drifting downward through layer after layer of darkness. By the time it reaches this depth, very little remains, and what remains is scattered, unpredictable. If a giant is in the right place at the right time, it receives that passing energy without effort, without pursuit. But if it is not, then the moment passes and nothing is gained. So the difference between survival and loss is not strength, it is presence. To be where something arrives before it disappears. This is where competition exists, not between creatures, but between moments. If two giants are near, when something drifts downward, they do not turn toward each other. They do not attempt to take. Instead, each remains within its own position, because movement might cost more than what is gained. So the one already aligned with the falling path receives it. The other does not, and that is enough. No reaction, no correction, only continuation. If you remain with this idea, you begin to see how different it is. Nothing is taken, nothing is stolen. Nothing is fought over. What arrives belongs to whoever is already there, and what is missed is simply gone. This creates a different kind of awareness, not focused on others, but focused on environment, on subtle shifts in the water, on patterns that are barely noticeable. Because even though everything drifts, it does not drift randomly. There are currents, slow movements that guide particles through certain paths, not fixed, not permanent, but present. If a creature senses these patterns, even faintly, it can remain within them, allowing food to come to it without needing to search, without needing to chase. So competition becomes a matter of alignment, not action, not speed, but stillness in the right place. If you follow a giant for a long time, you may begin to notice that it is rarely far from these paths, not because it knows exactly where they are, but because over time its movement has adjusted subtly, gradually, until it exists within a pattern that increases its chances, not guarantees, only chances. And that is enough, because here nothing is certain, only possible. If you think about this carefully, you may begin to understand how quiet this form of competition is. No visible struggle, no direct interaction, only difference. One creature receives something, another does not, and neither responds, neither reacts, because the outcome is not personal, it is environmental. It is simply the result of where each one happened to be at that moment. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how different this world is from what you expect. There is no urgency to correct what was missed, no attempt to recover what was lost, because chasing would cost more than waiting. So the only path forward is to continue, to remain within movement, to stay aligned as best as possible, and allow the next moment to arrive. If you return again to the image of two giants crossing paths, you may now see something else. They were not ignoring each other. They were focused on something else entirely, not each other, but the space around them, the invisible patterns that determine where energy will pass. And within that focus, there is no room for conflict, only quiet awareness. If you remain here in that understanding, you may begin to feel how complete it is. Competition exists, but it does not disturb the water. It does not break the silence. It does not create events. It exists within the smallest differences, in timing, in position, in the quiet alignment between a creature and the world around it. And because of that, nothing here needs to fight, nothing needs to prove, nothing needs to take. Everything continues within a balance that is shaped not by force, but by presence. And as you drift slowly through that vast, quiet space, you begin to understand that survival here is not about winning. It is about being there when something finally arrives. The weight of size. If you remain here, watching these giants move through a world that offers so little, you may begin to notice something that feels almost contradictory. They are enormous. Their bodies stretch far beyond anything that surrounds them. Their presence alone seems to define the space they occupy, and yet they move so slowly, so carefully, as if every motion must be considered before it begins. At first, this may feel unexpected because, in many places, size suggests power, strength, the ability to act without hesitation. But here, size means something else. It means weight, not just physical weight, but a kind of quiet burden, a requirement that must be carried through every moment of existence. If you imagine a body that large, you begin to understand what it requires. Energy, constant, even when it is not moving, even when it is resting. The body itself demands continuation. It must be sustained. Every part of it, every slow movement of internal systems that never stop. And in a place where energy is limited, this becomes significant. To exist at this scale is already costly. Before any action is taken, before any decision is made, the cost is already there. If that body were to move suddenly, to accelerate, to engage in something unnecessary, the cost would increase, not slightly, but dramatically, and what is spent cannot easily be replaced. So movement becomes something else, not expression, not reaction, but calculation. Even if that calculation is not conscious, it exists within the way the creature moves, within the way it avoids what is unnecessary, within the way it allows time to pass without interruption. If you follow a giant closely, you may begin to notice how little it changes direction, how rarely it accelerates, how smoothly it continues within a single path. This is not laziness, not hesitation. It is efficiency, a form of movement that reduces cost, that allows existence to continue without disruption, because every change has a price, and for something this large, that price is always high. If you think about smaller creatures, you may begin to see the contrast. They can move quickly, change direction, respond instantly. Because their bodies require less, their cost is lower, their margin for error is wider, but the giants do not have that freedom. They exist within a narrow balance where too much movement can create loss, where unnecessary action can extend beyond the moment and affect what comes next. So they do not move unless it matters, and most of the time it does not. If you remain here, you may begin to feel how heavy that is, not in a physical sense, but in a quiet, constant way. To exist at that scale means to carry the responsibility of every action, every movement, echoing forward into what will be needed later. Nothing can be ignored, nothing can be wasted. If you return again to the idea of conflict, you begin to understand why it does not occur. It is not just unnecessary, it is incompatible. A large body cannot afford unnecessary action. It cannot afford sudden change. It cannot afford to act without reason. So even when the possibility exists, it is held back, not through restraint alone, but through necessity. If you observe long enough, you may begin to see how this shapes everything. The pace, the distance between creatures, the absence of interaction, all of it connected to the same underlying truth. That size is not only power, it is limitation, a boundary that defines what is possible and what is not. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how quiet it makes this world, not because nothing can happen, but because everything that does happen must be worth the cost, and most things are not, so they do not occur. The giants continue, slow, steady, unchanged, not because they lack ability, but because they understand something deeply embedded within their existence. That survival here is not about doing more, it is about doing less, but doing it precisely. If you follow one of them as it moves through the darkness, you may begin to notice how natural this becomes, how effortless it appears. Even though every moment is shaped by careful balance, there is no strain, no visible effort, only continuation, because this is not a choice made in the moment. It is the only way this body can exist within this world at this scale. And as you remain there, watching that slow, steady movement, you begin to understand that being large does not mean being free. It means being bound to a different set of rules, quieter, stricter, more exact, where every action matters and every unnecessary action is simply left behind. And within that quiet restraint, the giants continue to exist, not by dominating the world around them, but by aligning with it perfectly, carefully, and without ever needing to do more than what is required. What truly rules the deep? If you remain here after watching how the giants move, how they avoid conflict, how they measure every action against what can be sustained, you may begin to notice something that shifts your understanding. At first, it is easy to believe that these giants rule this world. Their size alone seems to suggest it. They are larger than anything around them. Their presence feels dominant, unavoidable. And yet, if you continue to observe, that idea begins to soften, because nothing here truly belongs to them. Not the space, not the resources, not even the conditions that allow them to exist. All of it exists independently, unchanged by their presence. If a giant passes through an area, the water does not respond. It does not reshape itself. It does not hold the creature there. It simply continues as it always has. Currents move, particles fall, temperature remains constant, pressure does not shift in any meaningful way. The environment does not adapt to the creature adapts to the environment. And that difference is everything. If something truly ruled this space, it would shape it. It would influence what happens. It would control the conditions in which life continues. But the giants do none of these things. They do not alter the flow of energy. They do not change where food appears. They do not define where other creatures can exist. They move within what is already there, quietly, carefully, without leaving a lasting mark. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how absolute it is. No matter how large a creature becomes, it does not escape this rule. It cannot step outside the conditions of this world. It cannot override them. It cannot create something new. That was not already possible. Everything remains as it is, and the creature must align with it. If it does not, it will not continue. This is what truly governs the deep. Not strength, not size, not even survival itself, but condition, the quiet, unchanging framework within which everything must exist. If you return again to the idea of dominance, you may begin to see it differently. The giants do not dominate. They endure. They persist. They exist within boundaries that cannot be crossed. And those boundaries are set by something far larger than they are, not in size, but in influence. The environment does not need to act to remain in control. It does not need to respond. It does not need to change. It simply exists in a way that cannot be ignored, and everything within it must follow. If you remain here, you may begin to notice how consistent this is. Every movement aligned with pressure, every action limited by energy, every encounter shaped by distance. Nothing escapes it. Nothing overrides it. Even the largest forms must move carefully, must conserve, must avoid what is unnecessary, because the environment does not forgive excess. It does not correct mistakes. apex. It does not provide second chances. It simply continues, while anything that cannot align falls away. If you think about this long enough, you begin to understand why everything feels so quiet. It is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of resistance. Nothing here fights the environment. Nothing pushes against it, because pushing would only create loss. So everything adapts, everything conforms, everything becomes a reflection of the conditions that surround it. Even the giants, especially the giants, because the larger the form, the less freedom it has to deviate, the more precisely it must align. If you follow one of them as it moves through the darkness, you may begin to see it not as a ruler, but as a result, a shape formed by pressure, by scarcity, by time, a living response to a world that has never needed to change. And as you watch it continue, slowly, steadily, without resistance, you begin to feel how complete that relationship is. Nothing dominates, nothing controls. There is only alignment, a quiet agreement between light and the conditions that sustain it. And within that agreement, everything continues, not because it chooses to, but because it must. If you remain here in that understanding, you may begin to feel how different this is from what we expect. There is no throne, no hierarchy, no single creature that stands above the rest. Only a system that does not announce itself, that does not demand attention, but that defines everything nonetheless. And in that system, even the greatest giants are not rulers. They are participants, moving carefully within a world that has always been in control and will remain so long after they are gone. The illusion of the apex. If you have remained here this long, drifting through the slow movement of giants, watching how they meet, how they do not fight, how they exist within something larger than themselves, a final question may begin to form quietly, almost without words. Is there a ruler? Not in the way we usually think, not a throne, not a hierarchy, but something at the top, a presence that stands above the rest. Because in many places, we are used to that idea that somewhere there is always something greater, stronger, more dominant, an apex. And when we look at these giants, it is easy to assume that one of them must hold that place, that among them there is something that sits above all others. But if you remain here and allow that assumption to settle, you may begin to notice how little supports it. There is no clear center, no gathering point where one creature remains while others stay away. No territory that defines authority, no pattern of behavior that separates one from the rest. Each giant moves within its own path, each one existing under the same conditions, the same limitations, the same quiet boundaries that shape everything here. If one were truly above the others, you would expect something to reflect that, a difference, a sign, something that extends beyond size alone. But there is nothing. No creature changes the environment. No creature influences how others move on a larger scale. No presence that alters the balance. Everything remains even, not equal in form, but equal in constraint. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to understand why the concept of an apex begins to dissolve. Because an apex requires structure, a system where something can rise above everything else. But here, there is no structure to climb, nothing to hold, nothing to control, only conditions conditions that apply to everything. If something tried to become dominant, it would need to act, to move differently, to take more, to influence its surroundings. But all of those things require energy, and energy is limited. So any attempt to rise above the system would only bring it back into alignment, because the cost would exceed the gain, and what is lost cannot easily be recovered. So nothing rises, nothing claims, nothing remains above. Everything continues within the same quiet boundary. If you return again to the idea of power, you may begin to see it differently. Power here is not about control. It is not about position. It is not about being greater than something else. It is about fitting perfectly within the conditions that allow existence to continue. And the closer something aligns, the longer it remains. Not because it dominates, but because it does not resist. If you observe long enough, you may begin to feel how complete that is. Nothing is trying to be more. Nothing is trying to become something else. Everything is already what it needs to be within this world, and that removes the need for hierarchy, the need for comparison, the need for an apex. If you remain here in that quiet understanding, you may begin to notice how the giants feel different now, not as rulers, not as competitors, but as participants, each one moving through the same vast space, each one shaped by the same invisible forces, each one existing without needing to be above anything else. And as you follow one of them through the darkness, you begin to feel how steady that is, how complete. There is nothing to prove, nothing to become, nothing to overcome, only continuation. If you look out into the distance, you may imagine that somewhere there must still be something greater, something hidden, something that holds that final position. But the longer you remain, the more that idea fades, because nothing appears, nothing reveals itself as being above the rest. Only more space, more quiet, more of the same unbroken balance. And within that balance, the idea of an apex loses its meaning. It becomes something that belongs to another world, a different system, one where structure exists, one where dominance matters, but not here. Here, everything exists at the same level of necessity, bound equally to what can be sustained, and nothing can rise beyond that. If you stay with that thought, you may begin to feel how still it becomes, how complete, that even among giants, there is no highest point, no final authority, only existence, moving quietly within a system that has never needed one. And as that realization settles, you are left with something that feels almost unfamiliar, a world where nothing rules, and yet everything continues. What it means to survive here. If you remain here after letting go of the idea of an apex, after seeing that nothing truly rules this world, another understanding begins to take shape quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling that settles in slowly. What does it mean to survive here? Not just to exist for a moment, not just to pass through, but to continue, to remain within a place that offers so little. If you think about survival in other places, it often appears active, a constant movement towards something, searching, hunting, avoiding, responding. But here, that pattern changes. Survival is not about doing more. It is about doing less, but doing it with precision. If you follow a giant through this quiet space, you may begin to notice how little it actually does. It moves slowly. It receives what comes within reach. And it continues. There is no urgency to seek beyond that. No need to expand its range, because expansion would cost more than it returns. So survival becomes something internal, not external, not defined by what is gained, but by what is preserved. Energy, balance, continuity. If nothing is wasted, then existence continues. If something is lost unnecessarily, then everything becomes uncertain. So the entire structure of life here rests on a simple alignment. Take only what arrives. Spend only what is required. Allow everything else to remain untouched. If you stay with that idea, you begin to feel how quiet survival becomes. It does not announce itself. It does not create events. It does not draw attention. It simply continues without interruption. If a giant moves too much, it risks imbalance. If it reacts unnecessarily, it risks loss. So the safest path is not reaction, not pursuit, but consistency, a steady rhythm that does not deviate. If you remain here long enough, you may begin to notice how stable that rhythm is. It does not change with time. It does not respond to small variations. It remains within a narrow range that supports continuation. And within that range, everything works. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but consistently enough that life persists. If you think about failure, it also looks different here. It is not sudden, not dramatic. There are no visible signs of something going wrong, only a gradual imbalance, a quiet reduction in what is available, a slow shift away from stability, and eventually the absence of continuation. But even that does not disturb the environment. It does not change the system, because the system does not depend on any single life. Everything remains as it is, and something else takes its place. If you stay with that understanding, you may begin to feel how different survival becomes. It is not a struggle against the world. It is an agreement with it, a way of existing that does not push beyond what can be sustained. If you follow a giant again, you may begin to see it not as something powerful, but as something precise. Every movement aligned with what is needed. Every moment free of excess. Nothing wasted, nothing forced. And because of that, everything continues. If you return once more to the idea of competition, you may notice how it fades here as well. Because survival is not about outperforming others. It is not about being better. It is about remaining balanced. And balance, therefore, cannot be achieved through excess, only through restraint. If you remain here in that quiet realization, you may begin to feel how complete it is. Nothing is trying to survive in the way we expect. Nothing is pushing against its limits. Everything is moving within them carefully, exactly. And that is what allows life to continue here. Not strength, not speed, not dominance, but alignment. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to notice how still everything feels. Not empty, not lifeless, but steady, unchanging, as if survival itself has become something that no longer needs to be proven, only maintained. And within that maintenance, there is no urgency, no pressure, only continuation, a quiet, constant presence that does not seek more than what is already enough. And as you drift slowly through that endless darkness, you begin to understand that survival here is not about holding on. It is about not letting go of the balance that allows everything to remain exactly as it is. when survival becomes stillness. If you remain here long enough to feel the rhythm of this place, long enough to notice how little changes, you may begin to sense something that is easy to overlook. That survival here does not feel like effort. It does not feel like struggle. It does not even feel like something that needs to be maintained actively. Instead, it begins to feel like stillness, not complete stillness, not the absence of movement, but a form of quiet continuation that no longer demands attention. If you follow a giant as it moves through this depth, you may begin to notice how seamless everything becomes. Its movement blends into the environment. Its presence does not disturb the space around it. It does not create a path. It does not leave a trace. It simply exists within the same slow flow that defines everything else. And because of that, it becomes difficult to separate the creature from the world around it. They begin to feel like the same thing, not identical, but aligned so completely that one does not stand apart from the other. If you stay with that feeling, you may begin to understand how survival changes. When it reaches this point, it no longer requires attention. It no longer requires adjustment in every moment, because everything that could be adjusted already has been over time through countless small alignments, until the creature exists within a state that no longer needs correction. And when that happens, movement becomes quieter, more consistent, less noticeable, until eventually it feels almost like stillness. If you observe closely, you will still see motion, a slow shift forward, a gentle change in position, but nothing sudden, nothing that breaks the rhythm, nothing that calls attention to itself, because attention is no longer necessary. Everything is already where it needs to be. If you think about this deeply, you may begin to see how different it is from what we expect. We often imagine survival as something that must be maintained through constant awareness, constant effort, constant response. But here, the more aligned something becomes, the less it needs to do, until eventually doing less becomes the most effective way to continue. If you remain here within that understanding, you may begin to feel how calm it is. There is no urgency to act, no pressure to change direction, no need to seek something new, only continuation, a quiet extension of what is already working. If you follow the giant further, you may begin to notice how long it remains within this state, uninterrupted, unchanged, as if time itself has slowed, or perhaps as if time no longer matters, because nothing here is measuring it. Nothing here is moving toward an outcome. Everything is simply continuing, and within that continuation, survival becomes something else, not an effort, not a goal, but a condition, a state of being that does not require constant reinforcement. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how quiet it becomes inside you as well. The need to track movement fades. The need to anticipate disappears. Even the need to understand begins to soften, because nothing here demands interpretation. Nothing here requires response, only observation, only presence. And slowly, even that begins to dissolve, because when everything is already aligned, there is nothing left to adjust, nothing left to correct, nothing left to improve. Only stillness, not absolute, but sufficient enough to allow everything to continue. If you remain here, you may begin to notice how complete that feels, how stable, how undisturbed, as if the entire world has settled into a balance that does not need to move. And within that balance, even the largest giants become quiet, not because they have stopped, but because they no longer need to do anything more. And as you drift alongside them through that slow, endless space, you begin to understand that survival here has reached its final form. Not movement, not action, but stillness that continues without effort. And within that stillness, everything remains exactly as it is, without needing to become anything else. What remains in the end? If you remain here after everything has slowed, after the movement of giants has faded into the distance, after even the idea of survival has become quiet, you may begin to notice what is left. Not what happens, not what changes, but what remains. Because in a place like this, where nothing is held, where nothing returns, where nothing rises above anything else, there is very little that stays, and yet something does. If you look into the space around you, you will not find structure, no boundaries, no markers that define where anything begins or ends. Only depth, only distance, only the same quiet continuity that has always been here. If you think about everything you have seen, the giants, their slow movement, their silent encounters, their absence of conflict, their careful balance, none of it remains. Not in the space itself, not in the water, not in the environment. It has all passed without leaving a trace, and yet you remember it not as an event, not as something dramatic, but as a feeling, a quiet understanding that settles deeper the longer you remain, that nothing here needs to stay in order for everything to continue. If you follow that thought, you may begin to feel how complete it is, because what remains is not form, not presence, not even life in the way we recognize it. What remains is condition, the same quiet framework that has always been here, unchanged, unmoved, allowing everything to exist within it without ever needing to hold on. If you stay with that idea, you may begin to feel how still everything becomes, not empty, not silent, but settled, as if the entire world has reached a point where nothing more is required. No movement to prove existence, no action to maintain balance, no effort to become something else, only continuation. If you look again into the distance, you may notice that even the giants are no longer visible. They have moved on, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, until they are no longer within your awareness, and yet they still exist somewhere beyond perception, continuing within the same quiet rhythm, the same careful alignment. Nothing has ended, nothing has changed, only your view of it has shifted, and now you are left with the space itself, wide, endless, unbroken. If you remain here just a little longer, you may begin to feel how gentle that is. There is nothing to follow anymore, nothing to anticipate, nothing to understand, only presence, only the quiet awareness that everything is continuing without needing to be observed. And within that awareness, something else begins to settle, a sense that nothing here is trying to become more than what it already is. Nothing is reaching, nothing is resisting, nothing is holding on. Everything is simply existing within a balance that does not need to be changed. If you allow yourself to remain with that feeling, you may begin to notice how it extends beyond this place, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet shift that perhaps not everything needs to be held, not everything needs to be resolved, not everything needs to continue beyond the moment it exists. Because here, nothing does, and still everything remains. If you stay just a little longer, you may begin to feel how complete that is, how nothing is missing, how nothing needs to return, how nothing needs to be added, only what is already here, only what has always been here and will continue to be long after everything else has passed. And as the last trace of movement fades completely, you are left with something so quiet that it almost disappears. Not absence, not emptiness, but a kind of stillness that does not need to end. And within that stillness, everything continues without effort, without resistance, without needing to become anything else. Only this, only here, only now, and nothing more is required.